Again, thank you for being here. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Peter Baker serves as New York Times Chief White House Correspondent. In that capacity, I'm assuming his boss must give him combat pay. I hope he does. Peter is a terrific journalist, having served previously for 20 years at the Washington Post, where he covered the Clinton and George W. Bush presidencies. He's also served in Russia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. In 2008, Peter began his work with the New York Times, serving as White House correspondent covering President Obama. As that Obama administration was ending, the Times appointed Peter as bureau chief in Jerusalem, but then with the victory of Donald Trump, they called him back to be chief White House correspondent. Now, in addition to all that, because Peter doesn't obviously have enough to do, he's authored a lot of wonderful books as well. So he wrote The Breach, a great book about the impeachment and trial of President Clinton. If you haven't read that, you should. Kremlin Rising, all about Vladimir Putin's Russia. And Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House. So as you can see, Peter does not shy away from difficult, important topics. I got to know Peter during my service at the George W. Bush Library, where we were all fans of his book, Days of Fire. I thought it was really well researched, very even-handed in its analysis, and beautifully written. So I'm proud to call Peter a friend and colleague. And now, of course, Peter has penned Obama, The Call of History, about the presidency of a man from the land of Lincoln who has so much redefined our history. I can't tell you how much we appreciate Peter taking time from his extremely busy life to join us here tonight. Please welcome my friend, Peter Baker.
Thank you. Thank you. Boy, thank you all for coming. What a great crowd here. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah, good, great, terrific. Thank you. This is a fabulous crowd. Thank you. I can't thank the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum enough. Alan, my friend, who, as he told you already, we've gotten to know over the years. I couldn't respect him more. He did a fabulous job of setting up the George W. Bush Library. If you have any interest, you're in Texas, you should go by and see it. It's terrific. Obviously, he's doing a terrific job here as well. I had a chance earlier to look through the museum and got a little bit of a sneak into the vault as well. And I have to say, I called my wife like a geeky fan, and just was very excited to have a chance to be here. What a treat. I won't talk too long. I want to open it up for questions because I'm not very good at speechifying. But I want to start with this because I realize it's a different crowd than I usually have. I want to ask, how many people in this room were at the old State House when Barack Obama first announced for president? Okay, yeah. This is a crowd, huh? Well, this is something. Okay. So really, I should be asking you questions. You guys know him better than I do. What a great. I don't get an audience like this very often, so this is good. You're going to keep me honest if I get anything wrong. But I can't imagine a place better to talk about Barack Obama and kick off a book about Barack Obama's presidency than here in the land of Lincoln. I mean, as you all know, of course, when he kicked off his presidency, he did it very much emulating the 16th president. He launched his White House campaign, of course, from the old State House, where Lincoln began his career. He arrived in Washington on Inauguration Day for the inauguration along the same route that Lincoln took. Of course, he took the oath on Lincoln's Bible. He named a cabinet that everybody talked about it being a team of rivals, much like Lincoln's was. And so there was this very, very heady moment, of course, as you all remember, at the very beginning, in which we thought, here is another coming of Abraham Lincoln. But what was really interesting was he wasn't the only president we compared Barack Obama to, was he? It was remarkable to see the analogies that were out there, especially at the beginning. In the beginning, when we thought of him as this symbol of a hopeful new generation, he was cast as sort of a latter-day John Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, the cool Camelot with the beautiful African-American family living in the house that had been built in part by slaves, and what an extraordinary symbolic break from the past that was. We thought of him as FDR because he was taking over at a time when it looked like we might be heading into a whole new Great Depression, and we were already at war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Time magazine even put him on the cover with an FDR kind of, the cigarette holder and pince-nez glasses. Some people called him another George Washington. The New Yorker actually did a cover with him with a powdered wig. You remember that? Some people compared him even to Reagan, even though ideologically very different, but a harbinger of a new political era. When things started going bad, the comparisons kind of changed a little bit. He was likened to Lyndon Johnson for sending tens of thousands of more troops to Afghanistan. People made some Vietnam comparisons. Some people compared him to Dwight Eisenhower. They said he had a kind of a hidden hand presidency where he was quiet out in public, but pulling the strings behind the scenes and avoiding military entanglements the way Ike did. When things really went badly, people compared him to Richard Nixon and said that he was abusing his executive authority. Critics on the left said he was sometimes too much like George W. Bush because he didn't do enough to change the counterterrorism strategy that they didn't much like. Critics on the right called him a new Jimmy Carter. They said he was kind of an elite intellectual, kind of feckless in the Middle East. It got to the point where I remember interviewing one of his top aides about all this at one point, and he's kind of sighed. He says, "Sometimes I think the only president we haven't been compared to is Franklin Pierce," which is probably good because Pierce was kind of a drunk. And Barack Obama was not. But what that tells you, I think, is a little bit about who Barack Obama was, which is that we wanted to see in him many different things, right? He came on stage in the national sense as a bit of a cipher. We didn't know him the way you all knew him here in Illinois, and maybe some people in Illinois didn't know him as well as you do as well. He was as fresh a face on the national stage as we could remember winning the presidency in our lifetime, I think. Almost any other president had spent more time in a statewide or national office or position of power than Barack Obama had. Remember, just really 2 years in the Senate in Washington before he started running. And, I think that stems from the fact that he wasn't like any of the presidents we had before. We kept looking for analogies. We kept looking for comparisons because we wanted to be able to define him. Obama himself said during the 2008 campaign that, he didn't, quote, look like all the presidents on the dollar bills, which is true. And of course, that meant in some ways a reference to his role in breaking barriers. He was, of course, the first African-American president, but he didn't want to, and that was, of course, always going to be the first line in his obituary, but he didn't want that to be the only line in his obituary. He was determined to be more than just a new complexion in the Oval Office. And, so beyond his status as a avatar of a new era, he managed to both captivate and confuse the nation at the same time. He sort of presented himself as this, the champion of a new progressive era, right? He would bring healthcare universally. He would argue for the case for activist government, why it could be a force for good in society. And he also presented himself as kind of a non-ideological bridge builder, right? We're not a red America, we're not a blue America, we're all one America. And people saw in him very contradictory things that didn't necessarily reconcile to each other. It's hard to be both a champion of liberal values and a nonpartisan bridge builder at the same time. As he himself once said, I'm like a Rorschach test, and I think that's right. That's a good way to put it, because people saw in him what they wanted to see. And he was constantly defining and redefining and crafting his own identity. One of the things you see in a lot of the books that have come out about Obama is a sort of consistent theme, whether it be David Remnick's book or David Marinis's book or the new book by David Garrow. All of them talk about this idea of identity, about creating an identity. To some extent, Obama's success on the national stage was creating this identity for himself. First through this, what became a very best-selling book, very well-written, thoughtful, interesting discussion of race and society and his own generation. And then through the politics of modern society, through the arts of David Axelrod and David Plouffe and so forth. There was constant creation and recreation of identities throughout his rise. But he was kind of opaque. He was opaque even to those of us who covered him. He didn't come back to the press cabin on Air Force One and chit-chat with the reporters. He didn't throw his hand around you and ask how the kids were. He was the opposite of his very unfiltered vice president, Joe Biden, who would do all those things. Joe Biden, who's up there right now, right? Joe Biden is a very authentic man. Whatever you think of him, good or bad, right or wrong on the policies, he is what he is. He's exactly what you see in public. He used to have every year a barbecue on the lawn of the vice president's mansion, and for kids of reporters and staff. And they put up these moon bounces and these squirt guns and these water games all over the place. And he would run around the backyard squirting guns at all the super soakers, all the kids. Actually, the first year my kid was there, the first year the kids actually all teamed up and ganged up on him. By the second year, he figured it out. He rousted them and made them his posse, and he attacked the reporters. Very smart. That's not Obama, right? That's just not the kind of guy he was. He didn't roll that way. He's a very reserved personality. He's intellectualized. He is thoughtful, but he's not hail fellow well met. That's just not his style. He's not like George W. Bush. He didn't give out playful nicknames to people. He was not like Bill Clinton, who just charged into any crowd he could find. My favorite story about Bill Clinton, he would go out and hit the rope line while Hillary Clinton would wait in the limo for him when she was first lady, because it would just be endless. Because Bush and Biden Bush and Biden and Clinton, they are extroverts and they are political creatures, and they got a charge out of people, out of crowds. And Barack Obama was an introvert. Really the first introvert I think we've had in the White House probably since maybe Jimmy Carter. And he didn't get, he liked people, I'm not saying he didn't, but he did not get energy from a crowd the way some of those others did. In fact, his staff told me that they would have to try to leave about 5 or 10 minutes after some event in the East Room for him to kind of recharge his batteries, because it would drain him a little bit. That's not unusual, that's normal for a lot of people, but in politicians it's pretty unusual. And that's one of the things that made him, again, stand out as an unusual kind of president. But it doesn't mean that he was cold necessarily. Maureen Dowd in my office famously compared him to Mr. Spock, the character from Star Trek. But if you remember, Mr. Spock was half Vulcan. He was also half human, and I think that's not a bad comparison to think of. There is a human side to Barack Obama, just as there is to every one of our presidents. He loved to stay up at night watching SportsCenter. He was a fierce competitor on the basketball court, a real trash talker. He would just, he would bump and jostle with these young 20-something aides and razz them for how come they missed this shot, and come on, man, you got to pick it up. He told the ambassador to Russia, he was like, yeah, you got to get those knees going. He had a side to him that we didn't see in public as much that was pretty colorful. In fact, he would. He was a family man who made sure to leave the Oval Office by 6:30 every day so he could go home and have dinner with his kids. He used to say that one great thing about the White House was living above the store. He got to see his family more than he had on the campaign trail. He was very good about going to, the girls' basketball games on the weekends, and so we'd all get in the motorcade and we'd all go out there and wait in the car with the ambulance in the back while he's going and coaching basketball. And there are even emotional moments. I remember very vividly when the Newtown school massacre happened, and President Obama came out to the briefing room to talk about that, and he couldn't control himself. He lost his composure, which I don't think we don't see him do very often. He started to speak and then he paused for like 8 seconds, which if you think about it, is a long time for a president to stand there and not say something, and then he went on again, and then he paused again because he couldn't control his own emotional reaction to that thing, which again goes contrary to his reputation. But he took over at an extraordinary time and with great challenges. Right, we were on the economic abyss. There were wars in the Middle East. That we did see a revanchist Russia. At home, he had grand ambitions to reinvent healthcare and energy and climate change, immigration, gun control, and government spending. And some of this he managed to accomplish, but he also found himself the target of a conservative backlash. He alienated a lot of the country, and that we saw in the form of this sort of Tea Party rise that came and cost him both houses of Congress over the 2 elections that followed. In fact, Barack Obama won 2 national elections pretty convincingly, but the 3 other elections that really mattered to him, he lost all 3 of them. He lost the House in 2010, he lost the Senate in 2014, and of course he lost the White House in 2016. And the country was just in a sour mood throughout his presidency, even before he arrived, and through his entire presidency. Gallup polls showed not once did the American public, a majority of Americans in Gallup polls, say they thought the country was in the right direction. It's a very sour environment to be governing in. In fact, at one point in his first term, only 11% of Americans were happy with the country's direction. And so you had this phenomenon where the candidate of hope and change ended up presiding over an era of paralysis and polarization. I mean, it says something about that period that even something as, undeniably positive as hunting down and finally dispatching Osama bin Laden only produced a very short-lived sense of unity and consensus in the country. I think it's partly because the economic recovery pulled us back from the abyss, and it produced millions of jobs and cut unemployment in half. But it also left many people feeling behind and resentful. And there clearly was a sense that he had not represented a significant portion of the population as they saw their needs in government. He became, instead of a change agent to many Americans, part of Washington. I think it's actually, it's interesting in a lot of ways, but he's not the first president to come into office promising unity only to become a polarizer. In fact, all three presidents I covered before President Trump basically shared that aspiration. President Clinton, in his second term inaugural address, he used the phrase repairer of the breach. He wanted to be the repairer of the breach, as Isaiah said. And by that he meant the partisan breach in Washington. And within 2 years he had been impeached, and we were in a very partisan argument over his conduct and what was the proper response to that. President Bush came to office, remember, promising to be a uniter, not a divider. And I think he was just as genuine as the others in wanting that to be the case. And yet, through the Iraq War and through other decisions he made, the country was as divided as ever. And I think President Obama was surprised to discover that he couldn't fix that. It's the one thing he has said really publicly that he regrets. In one of his State of the Unions toward the end, he said, that's the thing I just underestimated how divided we are and my ability to bring people together. But and then that leads us to his successor, and who did not come into office promising to be a uniter, and has not governed as somebody who wants to unite clearly, and therefore in some ways represents the country and the times as we see them today. We blame our politicians for our paralysis, but in fact, in some ways, we ought to think about ourselves a little bit too, because they're representing us. We are these days more and more living, working, talking, and existing in a bubble with people who agree with us, right? If you're liberal, you watch MSNBC. If you're conservative, you watch Fox. But it extends beyond our viewing habits, even to where we live. The demographers have figured this out. There's actually a breaking point at 800 people per square mile. If you live in a place with fewer than 800 people per square mile, you're twice as likely to be a Republican. If you live in a place with more than 800 people per square mile, you're twice as likely to be a Democrat. So we're living with people who agree with us. In fact, the poll showed, it was really interesting, a poll back in the early 60s asked people, well, would it bother you if your son or your daughter married somebody from the other party? And only about 4 or 5% said yeah. And a few years ago, somebody asked the same poll again, and among Democrats, it was something like 35% said, yeah, I don't want any Republican in-law. And about almost 50% of Republicans don't want no Democrat hanging out at Thanksgiving. So we ourselves are increasingly divided, and I think that's the politics that has come to Washington and that President Obama struggled with, and that has challenged, I think, the last 3 presidents we've had. President Obama, he regularly noted, he says, look, the easy issues don't come to his desk, only the hard ones. And I think that's right, and that's not just true for him, that's true for every president. If it was easy, you don't need the president to get involved. So imagine that your whole time in office is spent dealing with the hardest questions possible. It got to the point where he was so beaten down by the hard choices in front of him that he and his first chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, now the mayor of Chicago, used to joke that they should just move to Hawaii and open up a t-shirt shack, and they would have just one kind of shirt, white, with just one size, medium. And it became such a running joke that every time they were in the Situation Room or the Oval Office and they faced some terrible choice, do we bail out the auto industry, do we authorize this drone strike, Rahm would turn to Obama and he would just say, white. And Obama would look back and say, medium. Look, if all these times took a toll on him. He didn't show it very much. Even if you look at these pictures, obviously he's a little grayer on top. But I think he carried himself through his presidency with a lot of calm poise. Very different, obviously, than other politicians who are more expressive, let's say. He rarely rushed into decisions, sometimes to a fault. He was a night owl. He sat alone at the White House late at night reading briefing papers or playing words with friends after his wife and daughters had gone to bed. He was a very disciplined guy. The only indulgence he permitted himself was a handful of almonds. In fact, his chef, the presidential chef, joked to my colleague and friend Mike Scheer that he only allowed himself 7 almonds. Not 6, not 8, 7 almonds. And that became sort of a running joke. Now, the president, by the way, denied that. Sometimes he did have 6 almonds. But I think it tells us something that was the joke that his own chef and his wife, by the way, used to make. But it was, I think it was a humbling journey for him. What started off as confidence seemed to many at sometimes to be hubris. He started off promising that his election was going to be the moment when the rise of the oceans would begin to slow and the planet would begin to heal. And by the low point of his second term, he had radically revised his expectations. And his staff, I remember telling me, well, maybe there are no Lincolns anymore. Maybe, there's only presidents who are trying to get through difficult times. But I thought that the exhibit here at the museum that I saw today reminded us that Lincoln was not a Lincoln at first either. In fact, if you look through the very apt display of the political cartoons of his time and the newspaper coverage, it was pretty tough. He was called all sorts of terrible things. People did not necessarily love Lincoln in all parts of the country, and they did not revere him the way we do today. So I think that's just the trial of being a president, is you find yourself constantly second-guessed, constantly scrutinized, constantly criticized, often for a good reason. But it's no question a very difficult job. And I think that for President Obama, there are things he can feel proud of. He does feel proud of for his legacy, bringing the economy back from the abyss, cutting unemployment in half, getting bin Laden. And then there are parts of his legacy that I think he wishes he could have done differently. Syria being an obvious example, his laying down of a red line that he didn't exactly enforce on the use of chemical weapons, and his inability to stop that civil war, his inability to find a formula that would keep America from becoming entangled in another Iraq, which is what he wanted to avoid, but somehow stopping a situation with hundreds of thousands of people who got killed. And I think that, these are the lessons that he learned. And he got to the point where he sort of lowered his own expectations. He realized that presidents can't sort of single-handedly change the world themselves, but they could do the best that they could and pass off to the future generation. He said to my friend David Remnick, he said, as a president, you're essentially a relay swimmer in a river full of rapids, and that river is history. And then he switched metaphors. He said, at the end of the day, we're part of a long-running story. We just try to get our paragraph right. And so this book, I hope, is at least the first draft of his paragraph. So with that, I'd love to see if we could open up, we could take some questions and see tell me what I got wrong about Obama and what we should be thinking. We've got a couple microphones, I think, in the audience, right? So we'll raise hands and we'll see if, tell me who you are. If give me your name and number, or not number. Give me your name and your credit card number, please, and we'll have a good conversation. How about right here? We'll have the microphone come.
Steve Elliott. I was wondering if you could tell us what happened to all the Czars.
What happened to all the
Czars.
Oh, the Czars. Oh, right. Can you hear me, by the way, with this microphone? Good. Okay. So the question is, what happened to all the Czars, right? You remember one of the things that President Obama did was he appointed an energy czar, Middle East czar, all these czars in the White House and the State Department, and it's kind of a political fiction to make you think that they're going to do something, right? He's not the only one to do it, but the idea of a czar sounds good. We're going to have somebody really cut through the bureaucracy. Some of them worked. I mean, some of them really did important things. When he appointed Ron Klain to supervise the response to Ebola, it made a difference. I mean, they actually did manage to not conquer, but at least to stop the spread of Ebola in West Africa and to keep it from spreading here in America. But some of them didn't work out, and they went back to normal ways of doing things. President Trump has basically done away with czars. I think in his White House there's one czar, and I think he likes to be the guy in charge, and he wants to make sure everybody knows it. We must have other questions. Come on. Here we go, right here.
Am I supposed to tell you my name?
If you'd like, I would like that.
Oh, my name is Katherine Harris.
Hi, Catherine.
It's very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
My question is, do you think that one of the current president's things to do is to tear down the legacy that the previous president had?
Yeah, that's a great question. Did you hear the question about it? Is the current job of the president to tear down the legacy of a previous president? Look, I've written about this recently, and I have a piece in tomorrow's paper sort of talking about this very subject, so you're very timely. I think that every president comes in wanting to set a new direction, especially those, obviously, who are succeeding a president of another party. What I find striking is how much this president, President Trump, makes it a point of undoing things his predecessor had done. You know, when Dwight Eisenhower became the first Republican to come in after FDR and Truman, he didn't undo the New Deal. It was, he basically left it in place. When Richard Nixon came in, he didn't undo the Great Society. He more or less left it in place. Ronald Reagan promised to abolish Jimmy Carter's Department of Energy and Department of Education, but in the end he didn't. Because I think these presidents wanted to move forward with their own proactive agendas, their own things they wanted to build. That, again, they did different things than the previous president. They definitely took them different courses, but they didn't spend a lot of time undoing things. And President Trump, in his first 6 months, has spent a lot of time trying to undo things. He obviously pulled the country out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement that President Obama had negotiated. He pulled the country out of the Paris Climate Agreement that President Obama had negotiated. He reversed him on the Keystone Pipeline. He has undone a lot of environmental and business regulations. He has tried to reverse the health care plan and the Dodd-Frank Wall Street regulations, and he's been very critical of things like the Iran nuclear deal. I think that what they would argue, what President Trump would argue is, like a real estate developer, you got to clear out the lot before you can build a new building, and they want to clear out what they think are damaging or wrong-headed things that his predecessor had done, and that would be better for the country, and then he can come and build new programs that he wants to build. But it's, I think the risk is you end up looking as a negative rather than a positive, right? Presidents want to be a positive force, and I think that we see with this healthcare debate just this week, just the last 24 hours, that it's not so easy to undo things that previous presidents have done, especially things that involve legislators and other countries, like the Iran deal. Where President Trump has had success in undoing some of President Obama's legacy were things that were done by executive authority, right? That he could do by himself without needing Congress to do anything. And you could argue President Obama basically, made his own bed, because he did a lot of things through executive authority when he got frustrated that Congress wasn't going along with him. So if you do things, if you live by the pen and phone, that was the strategy that President Obama talked about, you're going to die by the pen and phone. So, but the last 24 hours we see with health care that Congress isn't so easy to go along, even when it's your own party. And I think we now have seen that effort now has, I'm not saying it's dead, because anything can always happen in Congress, but I don't see how it gets any easier for them in the weeks to come. So that leads the question is, if Obamacare then survives, what shape is it in? Is there going to be any need to do things to shore it up? Because some of these exchanges are, in fact, having real trouble. And Senator McConnell, the majority leader, has said, maybe we need to work with Democrats to find ways to at least shore up these exchanges so that people aren't, struggling to find anybody to insure them in some of these counties with only one provider and so forth. But I don't know whether Republicans and Democrats can come together to do that. And that's going to be a real interesting test. So, right here.
Do you feel that once President Obama became president, that was the beginning of our partisanship, I mean, I have looked back through the years, even, you know, Vietnam War and Nixon and Reagan and even second Bush with the Gulf War. I did not see the adamant partisanship there is now. You know, you got your liberal and you got your conservative, and we're not going to talk to each other.
Yeah.
Did it start big time with him?
That's a great question. The question for anybody who didn't hear is, did the partisanship really get started with Obama? Is that what really got it going? I would say no. I would say that our country actually has been virulently partisan from the beginning. In fact, we built the system to be this way. We built this to be hard, right? We didn't say, okay, we got a king. We said we got 3 branches of government, and all of them have, to some extent, co-equal power. We made it hard to pass a law. We said, not only do you have to get one house to pass, you have to get 2 houses to pass. They have to agree on the same law, has to have the same wording, and then you send it to a president, and he or she has to approve it. So I think we build in conflict into our system to start with. And I think that if you look back at history, there have been really rough times. All you have to do is walk around, you know, this great facility and the other facility across the street to understand how deeply divided our country has been at various moments. Obviously, not every day do we have a civil war. That's, thank God, at the extreme that we're hopefully never going to see again. But the issues have continued to divide us. I think you mentioned some of them. I think McCarthyism was a period of great divisiveness. I think the period of Watergate and Vietnam and you know, we've had moments of great divisiveness in the past. I think what has happened, though, I think that it has grown more partisan to some extent, partly because the political parties since the 60s have increasingly drifted to their ideological homes, right? When LBJ was trying to get civil rights bills through Congress, he worked with Northern Republicans, right, and some Democrats, and it was the Southern Democrats who were on the other side. Now today, anybody, you know, exactly, all the conservatives are more or less in one party, all the liberals are more or less in another party, and so it's more Republican-Democrat than it used to be. But I'm not sure that it's not liberal-conservative, right? And I think that, you know, different parties would point to different moments. The real start of today's modern partisan polarization is fill in the blank. Robert Bork's nomination, when they really went after him, those Democrats were so mean. Or Clarence Thomas, or Jim Wright, or Newt Gingrich, or Clinton's impeachment. You know, anybody can point to a starting point and say, really from that point it really became much more partisan. I think it's just been growing with each presidency. I think the last 30 years we have seen a rise through each presidency, and it's been encouraged by the thing we just talked about our demographics, right? If you're a Republican congressman, you are much more likely to be challenged from the right than you are from the left. So you have to worry about your conservative base. Same is true on the left. If you're a Democratic congressman, you have to worry about your left, your liberal base, more than you have your right. So you're not as likely to work together on bipartisan legislation because there's no reward for it. There's only penalties. They see penalties. Congress and politics is about incentives and disincentives. And for Congress, it used to be that there was an incentive to be at least seen as bipartisan. Today, that's considered to be a disincentive. You're not loyal. You're a rhino. You're not a Republican. You're a Republican in name only, or you're a soft, you know, liberal. President Obama, we forget about this today because his numbers are really much higher today than they've been in quite a while. I saw a Bloomberg poll that said he's as popular today as he was in the first year of his presidency when he was still riding high. But what we forget is, for a lot of his presidency, liberals are really kind of disappointed with him, that he wasn't more liberal. He forsake us on public option. He's adopted Bush's counterterrorism strategy, blah, 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 blah. So I think that the incentive structure is for more partisanship, and I think that's been fueled by social media, Twitter, Facebook, all these venues that serve to pull us apart more and amplify the angry voices more, right? And I would say the media probably plays a role in that too. I'm sure we amplify that as well. But I think about this, people say, well, you know, you got all these death threats now and so forth, Twitter and all that. And I think, well, I think those people used to be out there, but they just, you know, they had to actually sit down and write a letter and find an address and get a stamp and put it on an envelope and walk it to the post office. And it was a lot harder, right? And today, you know, they, done, right? What did Lincoln do? When Lincoln was angry, Lincoln is a great example. When Lincoln was angry, and he had real anger at his generals, particularly McClellan, he'd write some really scathing letter and he'd put it in a drawer. right? And he wouldn't send it till the next day, and by the next day, he really thought better of it. Nobody puts a letter in the drawer. Nobody puts a tweet in the drawer, right?
But we wish that he would.
Certain people wish he would. Journalists, maybe not so much. How about over here? Just gonna bring you the mic.
Could you tell us about your wife and family, and also about Gwen Ifill?
Yeah.
And also, maybe many of you have forgotten, but we used to have something called a fairness doctrine, which would have prevented Rush Limbaugh from having his show on the radio because he would have had to have opposing viewpoints on it.
Yeah, the question, a couple questions about the fairness doctrine, Gwen Ifill, and my wife and son. The fairness doctrine has sort of been supplanted by the proliferation of media, right? I think the fairness doctrine, I'm not a legal expert, but I think the idea was that was back in the day when we had 3 channels, you know, and a couple major national newspapers, and that was pretty much it. Today, if you want your voice heard, no matter how extreme, no matter how left, how far right, whatever, there are venues for you to do that, and places that Rush Limbaugh and others, and the equivalent on the left, can get their message out. So I think that the larger attitude today on that is, as long as there's a marketplace of ideas out there that people have access to, that's the most important thing. And by the way, I think in general, that's good. I think the proliferation of media is good. I think it's great to have a Huffington Post and a Daily Caller, right? A liberal and a conservative news outlet. What worries me is that we only read those that we agree with, right? What I tell people is if you watch MSNBC and you like MSNBC, great. Every once in a while, turn on Fox. Just for the, I know. Turn it on anyway. Maybe you'll substitute for coffee in the morning because it'll get you up, right? It'll get you going. But at the very least, no, and by the way, I always say the same thing to Fox people. I tell people who watch Fox, watch MSNBC every once in a while, and they get all worked up too. And I think I think it's just healthy that we understand that other parts of the country see things differently. We don't have to agree with it. In fact, I'm not telling you to agree with anybody. I'm just saying it's healthy for us to understand how maybe another segment of our country sees the world, what issues are important to them, what lens they're seeing things through. We'll understand them better, maybe they would understand us better, whatever. But I think that we take a risk if we only read or watch things that we agree with. Gwen Ifill, by the way, would agree with that. Gwen Ifill, of course, was my friend and host of Washington Week for so many years, and my model of an amazing journalist, maybe the best television journalist I ever knew, maybe the best journalist I ever knew. I mean, what I loved about her was her curiosity and her fascination with a story and the people behind them, and she just wanted to know things and figure things out and talk about them. And if she had a partisan bone in her body, I didn't know what it was. You know, she was fair to everybody. She was very even-handed. She just cared about the issues and things that were important to the country and wanted people to talk about it. And I loved being on her program every chance I got. And I'm very sorry she's gone, but she left us a great legacy that we should all try to emulate. My wife is the other greatest journalist I know. She was the editor of Politico until after the election. She founded Politico magazine, which is part of what they do right now, and brought in longer form stories, deeper magazine style journalism to what Politico did. Before that, she was editor of Foreign Policy. We were in Moscow together. I think Alan mentioned that. She's an amazing editor, an amazing reporter. Today, she's doing a weekly podcast. I urge you to listen to it, called Global Politico. She interviews really interesting people every week. Jim Baker, Condi Rice, all sorts of fascinating people. So we have a journalistic household. You worry though about bringing up a kid in Washington. There is a danger to it. They become very Washington, right? So my son, who I love more than anything in life, went and played in the pool the other day with his friends, and instead of playing Marco Polo, they played Marco Rubio. I'm like, okay, that's probably not good, you know. Marco Rubio. No, it's true. He's 12. He said to me, he says, actually, Dad, I tried to get them to play Mike Pence, but they were having none of it. But he's a great kid, and I hope he does something other than journalism. But anyway, he's 12. Thank you. How about right here?
Back to the polarization issue that we've been having for the last 30 years or more, where do you see it going? Do you see any solution to it? Are we going to be able to end it before it destroys us? Or?
Yeah. That's a great question, and it's really one of the central questions of our time. And I don't know. I really don't know. You sort of feel like at a certain point it burns itself out. That at some point we kind of say, okay, we have to find a different way of doing things. But every moment that encourages people to say that, diminishes almost immediately, vanishes almost immediately. Sometimes it happens after these terrible acts of violence, right, where we all kind of come together and say we are one country, we're all Americans, we ought to have our differences civil and respectful, and then that lasts about 5 minutes, right? And so I don't know what event or what issue would change the dynamic. And I think that the mechanisms in place, the accelerants, as the arson investigators would call them, are still there. I don't know how that changes it. I think, and it's, look, I mean, it's there are people out there who find that good. The one thing that President Trump has shown us is that people want him, his supporters at least, want him to fight. And they think that the accommodation between left and right, or Republican and Democrat, have made them too much alike, that there is in fact this permanent class in Washington that has taken us all for a ride, and that we need an outsider to break things up. And so they took a chance on a guy who'd never been in public office before because they were so deeply frustrated with the existing system that they sent basically a bulldozer to Washington and said, tear it down and let's try it again. Now, isn't going to work out that way, and we'll see how he adapts, because it just doesn't work out that way. And I don't know how the public is going to respond. At the moment, obviously, polls show that he has lost support. He's at 36% in the polls, but that could change. He's obviously a remarkable political figure. He did something that nobody would have ever expected an outsider like him to do, and we'll see how he managed to take the 6 months he's had so far and translates it for the next 3.5 years. How about right here?
My name is Kim Eford. I wanted to know, do you think we know more than now what Cheney says and tell Obama, the reason why they should continue Bush's policies in Afghanistan, anti-terrorism or whatnot? You say that he retained Bush's policies. I was wondering if we know more now than then about what were Cheney's excuses, Cheney's reasoning that maybe changed Obama's mind.
Well, it's interesting. So the question is about Obama preserving some of what President Bush had done in terms of counterterrorism. I think one of the things that people, we get confused a little bit, because President Obama runs against first-term George W. Bush, but he inherits second-term George W. Bush. And by that I mean, before leaving office, Bush himself had already actually moderated and changed a lot of his policies. Waterboarding hadn't happened in his second term at all. And so when President Obama comes in, he bans torture. It had already actually stopped. President Obama wanted to close Guantanamo. President Bush had started off that path before he left office. In fact, he got more detainees moved out of Guantanamo than President Obama did. He didn't finish it any more than President Obama did. He got the Congress to approve the secret surveillance program that everybody objected to, that the New York Times broke the story about. Congress ultimately bought into it, put in some safeguards. Senator Obama voted for it. So the military tribunals that the Supreme Court had rejected were recast and put through Congress, and Congress bought into it. So President Bush spent a lot of time in his second term trying to moderate his program, get rid of some of the harshest edges, the more extreme edges that people objected to, so that the next president, Republican or Democrat, wouldn't feel the need to throw it all out. And he more or less succeeded. Cheney objected. Cheney actually fought Bush tooth and nail in the second term against a lot of these decisions he made, and was very upset about that. So at the beginning of Obama's presidency, when you see Cheney kind of coming after Obama publicly, what you really saw was sort of a proxy for Cheney's private fight that he had been having with Bush for the 4 years prior to that. He could say things about Obama that he would never say about Bush, but his feelings were more or less the same, which is that change in policy to him were dangerous and too weak-minded, and that the end of Bush was closer to the beginning of Obama than Cheney would have liked. Iraq, real quick on Iraq, by the time Bush leaves office, because of the surge or because of other things, the situation there had calmed down a little bit, the security was better, and he signed an agreement with the Iraqis to pull all American troops out by the end of 2011. Well, what did President Obama do when he came office? He did the exact same thing. He kept the Bush schedule. So there was more continuity between the end of Bush and the beginning of Obama than anybody might have thought if you had just watched the campaign trail and listened to the rhetoric. So I think right behind you, too, we had one, yeah.
My name is Edna Walden, and I wanted to follow up on the partisanship question someone had. We know Mitch McConnell said early on he wanted to make sure President Obama did not have a second term. And so from the beginning, that's what the Republicans wanted to do. Now that the Affordable Care Act and what they wanted to do has been defeated 3 times now, do you think, and another thing he says now, the Democrats won't help us. Well, they didn't help the Democrats when they tried to do it. Do you think now that this has happened, maybe now this will get them to work together?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, one man's obstructionism is another man's principled resistance, right? And there's no question that the Republicans didn't do a lot to help President Obama, and the Democrats aren't doing a lot to help President Trump. And you can argue how much Obama should have done more, or Trump should have done more to reach out. It is the nature of our times. Each party rewrites the rules to be more divided, and then when power shifts, complains about the rules they had just put in place because the other guys again get to use the exact same rules. So it's not surprising to me the Democrats aren't going to go along with President Trump repealing something they consider to be their biggest achievement. Why would they, right? It's also not surprising to me the Republicans didn't go along with President Obama in the first place because they didn't agree with him on a lot of stuff. Now, I'll correct you on one factual thing. Mitch McConnell, for better or worse, he said that at the end of near the end of the second year of President Obama's term, when they were heading into the midterm, and he said it in a campaign context. And I think if you put any Democrat on a truth serum, they would say their goal is to make President Trump a one-term president as well. That's the nature of a partisan system. A better example for your point probably might be that on the night of his inauguration in 2009, a number of Republicans got together, including Paul Ryan, and had dinner, and then began to lay out what they would basically be a pattern of resistance or obstruction or whatever phrase you want to use. So from the beginning, in that sense, those folks did in fact say, we're not going to cooperate. This is not a presidency we want to be part of. And again, it's because I think the incentive structure is now, doesn't work. I mean, it does seem to me that there are things that both parties agree ought to be done to fix the healthcare system, that even if you like Obamacare, there are things about it that certainly liberals would like to fix, and conservatives understand, are broken as well. And that there is a moment here where we might see it. McConnell himself, Mr. Dr. No, or whatever, I've forgotten his name, Senator No, did say, we might have to now work with Democrats. I know it's a hard thing to imagine, but it is conceivable, because without some sort of legislative fix, there are a lot of problems out there. And I don't know. President Trump today said, "I'm just going to let it fail, and it'll just collapse, and then the Democrats will be to blame, and then they'll want to work with me." That's a very interesting attitude. And I don't know how that'll play out. I'm not an expert on healthcare policy, but I think that I think we haven't seen the end of the issue. I just don't have a lot of. I stopped making predictions in Washington, and one prediction I really stopped making is the idea that there'll be bipartisanship. Right here. She'll bring the mic.
Thank you. I just can't help but bring up how much the country has been confronted with the issue of race as being a real strong catalyst to the obstructionism. And, you know, from the beginning of President Obama's presidency, it has seemed that that has been the underlying tone that nobody wants to talk about, and least of all him. And what I see, I mean, I'm only 40 years old, so I don't have I haven't been through that many presidencies in my adult life, but the degree of the divide and the nature of the divide seems like nothing else ever before. People don't talk about the difference in policy anymore. We're talking about anger and just vile, hateful language and hating each other, and it's very, very deep and dark and depressing to me. And what I see now, like going forward, is when people talk about, when I hear people who are very conservative or right wing say, Obama was the biggest divider of them all. Immediately, what comes to mind is, well, he didn't divide you, but perhaps he made you face what you don't want to see. What you don't want to admit, what you never would say out in public, which is that this is not the type of president, this is not the color of president I want and can handle. And that has, to me, turned everything upside down. And my husband and I, and my husband's, Caucasian, and we always talk about, is this the conservative old man, white man's last stand to just like hold down everything and just, be as hateful and as racist and misogynist as possible? And I feel like everything is turned upside down. And when nobody has empathy for each other, we don't talk about, nobody talks about, let's look at why we, voted no for this healthcare plan. What did you not like about it? Why did you vote no? No, let's just come out publicly and talk about the fact that you voted no. I mean, we teach our children to be, to talk about issues differently than this. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. No, I appreciate the point. I really do. And there's no question, look, there's no question a certain part of the country did not like Barack Obama as president because of reasons of race. No question about it. This country is not, we have not solved that issue, right? As much as this moment in Grant Park 8-9 years ago might have made us think that we had moved, we have not moved as far as people had hoped, right? I was struck, actually, I remember in 2000, I was struck that even people, actually, a lot of Republicans found Obama's election a hopeful sign, even if they didn't vote for him. George W. Bush liked Barack Obama. A lot of Bush's people voted for Barack Obama, including, I believe, his top economic people who were quite bothered by what they saw on the other side. I think John McCain, even when he lost, at least for a small moment, found at least some good in the idea that the country had elected somebody who never would have ever been elected in the past, even though he didn't want this particular guy to win this particular election because he would prefer to win and thought he was a better candidate. And then we saw what happened over those 8 years, obviously, with race being such a big flashpoint. And one that the president himself was very, as you say, very reluctant to address. He did not want to be an African-American president. He wanted to be a president who was African-American, right? He wanted to be president of all people. He wanted to be judged and evaluated on his climate policies and his national security policies and economic policies. He did not want to be thought of entirely through a racial prism, and he avoided talking about it, particularly in his first term. In his second term, freed of the worry about a re-election and confronting a more virulent series of events in the country that made it harder to ignore, he became more vocal about it, right? Remember early on he felt burned by the Skip Gates episode. You remember Skip Gates, the Harvard professor, African-American, comes to his home, is arrested in his own home by a Cambridge, Massachusetts police officer, mistaken arrest, obviously, very racially charged. The President of the United States is asked about it at a press conference and says, I think they acted stupidly. And it causes big fuss. You criticize the police, oh my gosh, da da da. And we have to have a beer summit, right, in the White House where we bring the cop and the professor together and we all have a beer. Well, President Obama did not want to have another beer with another set of people like that. So he didn't talk about it for 4 years. But with Trayvon Martin and Ferguson and Baltimore and so on and so forth, he really didn't have a choice. And he began talking about it more, and he began to find his voice a little bit more. And I think that we all discovered that there's still a lot of real issues out there. I think President Trump obviously runs a campaign that, at the very least, takes advantage of some of that. And you could argue through the whole birther thing, stokes it, right? Having said all that, let's keep in mind that the ugliness of our politics did not start with Barack Obama. Critics accused the most extreme elements of the country accused Bill Clinton of murdering Vince Foster, of running drugs out of Mena, Arizona, of all sorts of things for which there's actually no evidence, as well as things for which there actually, in some cases, as we saw, there was some obviously misconduct. But the more extreme versions of it were like he had rolled up Vince Foster in a rug and took him out to the park. It was extraordinary, the things that he was accused of. By the way, same with George W. Bush, accused of extraordinary things. We can criticize Bush for all sorts of things. We can criticize Clinton for all sorts of things. Bush was also, he was called a Nazi. He was compared to Hitler. We've talked about this Julius Caesar play in New York. Well, there's a whole movie made called The Assassination of George W. Bush. How is that, a civil thing? It's not. Of course it's not. So I'm not saying race doesn't play a role. It does. But ugliness, unfortunately, is part of our politics right now. And that was one more element that President Obama confronted, or in some cases chose not to confront. But I think he left office feeling a little disappointed that he wasn't able to do more, that we had not become a post-racial society, and that he didn't get everything done he wanted to do. I'm getting a hook here, I think. One more question right here? Okay.
The American presidency, there's 6 living presidents. Are they more, and it's a small fraternity, are they more a team of rivals or just rivals?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, there's 6 living presidents. Are they more of a team of rivals or rivals? And I think that's a great question. I actually think they're much more alike than we think. Okay, let's put the current guy aside for a second. I mean that only that he is a different figure and he has a different style, and he's currently in office, and being in office makes things different. But if you watch, just the other night, President Bush and President Clinton got together at the Bush Presidential Center in Dallas, and they had a talk, and those guys were great together, right? And they're joking and making, and having interesting insights about the nature of the presidency and the nature of our country, and you wouldn't think that they were of different parties and they had battled through, repeated elections in pretty tough ways. And I think that's because, especially when you leave office, there are only 6 people alive who have confronted the issues that they have confronted. And the choices available to them do not get any better if the other party takes over. I mean, the choices are still rotten to the core, white, medium, right? And so I think they they understand each other better. They have more of a shared sense of purpose and experience that nobody else can understand. And I think that they do get along, especially after they leave office, much better than they do when they're in office or campaigning, because they have moved to a different stage of their lives and a different stage of the life of the nation. So, I think President Obama, likes President Bush, likes President Clinton, likes Papa Bush, President Bush 41, I think, and Jimmy Carter too. So I think that, look how much good friends Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford became, right? 41 and Clinton. Clinton says he's the black sheep of the family. He's the and George W. Bush calls him my brother from another mother. They end up sharing things. And by the way, when I covered them, the 3 before Trump that I covered, I saw similarities that did not have anything to do with ideology or politics. So like Bush and Clinton were much more alike in the sense of their sort of outgoing nature, in their love of politics and being with people, their sort of gregarious approach to the world. Obama was like Clinton in the sense that he liked to dig deep on an issue and spent a lot of time thinking about it, maybe too much time thinking about it. If you ask his aides, can't we just get to a decision? They had a problem getting to a decision. Once the decision was made, Obama was like Bush. He never looked back. He didn't second guess things. He didn't question things. He was very disciplined in that regard. The decision's made, we move on. So they all have these sort of personality traits that you could compare to each other that have nothing to do with party. And I think the experiences, broadly speaking, are more alike than they're not. And again, this guy will be an interesting test of whether that's the case when he leaves office. So.
Well, thank you all for coming. Let's thank you.
Okay. Thank you, guys. This is great. A lot of fun.